This is CKCU 93.1 FM in the nation's capital.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jared Shook, a.k.a. Professor Shook, and I'm here with DJ Morpheus for CKCU 93.1 Ottawa Roots Radio, where we, through critical university engagement, radical community involvement, and active participation in movements for social, economic, and environmental justice, discuss important issues that are happening in your community. And we're here in studio today with Farid Khan, human rights activist. And today we're going to be talking about what has been described as a genocide in Myanmar. But before we get to that, I'd like to just pass things off to DJ Morpheus so we can acknowledge the land that we're currently speaking from.
Yeah, so we're speaking to you on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory. And discrimination, they've been going through the genocide and theft of their lands. And so, yeah, we always stand in solidarity with Anishinaabe peoples and all Indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island and beyond. Thank you for that.
And so just to get right into the show, as I said, I'm here today with Farid Khan, who is actually an alumni of Carleton University. So welcome to the studio. He's a human rights activist to himself, is actually the child of refugees, and has taken up the cause of drawing attention to what he and others have described as the first genocide of the 21st century, taking place in Myanmar. Some of you may know that as Burma in Southeast Asia, where the Rohingya Muslim minority, an officially stateless people, are being systematically targeted by the military and majority fundamentalist Buddhists who have been accused of such atrocities as summary executions, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, forced labor, the burning of villages, and rape against the Rohingya women. And all of this has apparently been taking place under the leadership of Nobel laureate and de facto head of state who had prior been referred to as the Mandela of Southeast Asia, Aung San Suu Kyi. So today what we're going to try to do is get a clearer picture of who Aung San Suu Kyi really is in light of her record of addressing these crimes against humanity. And we're also going to try and get a better understanding of who the Rohingya people are, what has been happening to them, and why we should be paying attention. Of course, we'll be fitting this within the context of Farid's recent campaign to call upon the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada to take action by revoking the honorary citizenship which was bestowed upon Aung San Suu Kyi, and also, calling attention to what is happening and asking for other international partners like the United Nations to engage Canada to perhaps take some action on this issue. So we're going to try and flesh it out, get a sense of what's really going on. So again, like I said, Farid, welcome to the studio. We're very happy to have you here. So let's start with Aung San Suu Kyi. So some of our listeners may know she was notoriously, well, not notoriously, but there was a high-profile record of her having been a political prisoner in Burma. I think 15 of 21 years from 1989 to 2010. She was a political prisoner under house arrest there while the country was being ruled by the military junta. Eventually, she was released from house arrest, engaged in politics, and ended up essentially becoming head of state and was feted, particularly by the Western community, for bringing democracy to Burma. She won actually a Nobel Peace Prize, and as I said earlier, she was described as the Nelson Mandela of Burma. But now we're in a situation where there's sort of been what some would maybe call a fall from grace. Her recent record with regards to what is being described as a genocide taking place in Burma is definitely something that is unsatisfactory to this critical community that you're a part of. So maybe you can fill the listeners in a little bit more on Aung San Suu Kyi, her record, and why she's an important actor in this issue.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be on your show. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak about this very important subject, which has caught the attention of the media finally after years and years of languishing in the darkness, talking about a people who have essentially been voiceless. And as you said, they have been referred to, or the UN has actually called them, the most persecuted minority in the world. And just a little bit of history. Yes, Aung San Suu Kyi, the current leader of Myanmar, is, we are focusing a lot of attention on her, but this has been going on for decades. The persecution of the Rohingya actually began. They were already a bit of a marginalized community in back then it was called Burma, in the years after World War II. But after the military coup in the early 80s, they actually passed a law in the Burmese legislature, national legislature, which stripped the Rohingya of their citizenship. And
effectively making them stateless people.
Exactly. Effectively making them stateless. And this despite the fact that the Rohingya have roots in that region, in that what is currently Myanmar. They have roots in that region going back 1,000 years. So they are not a Johnny-come-lately group who just arrived, crossing over the border.
So I'd like to connect there. So some of the information that I was able to acquire in my recent research is that the citizens of Myanmar, essentially they're trying to say that the Rohingya are simply Bangladeshian immigrants.
Exactly. They're saying that they're basically Bengalis who have, who have arrived recently, and that is totally contrary to the historical data and the facts. And academic research, totally disproves that statement. Okay.
So what I was to understand is that the Rohingya actually have a history dating back to that particular geographic territory across a millennium?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, very interesting. So the Rohingya people, there are estimated to be about 1 million of them currently living in Myanmar, or perhaps before this crisis emerged. I know that a number of them have actually fled the country to go to different places. So how many Rohingya are currently in Myanmar?
Well, before this most recent crisis started, there were approximately 1 million, maybe a little over 1 million. Since the end of August, almost 500,000 Rohingya have been on the move because of the military crackdown, which, as you referenced, it's involved the burning of villages. It's involved killing people just for being Rohingya, and there's no discrimination. Women, children have been killed. I've read eyewitness accounts where children were thrown thrown into burning houses to be burned to death. Women have been mass raped by not only the military but also by nationalist mobs who are supported by the government.
So this is actually something that's difficult for me to comprehend. So Aung San Suu Kyi, who essentially was punished by this military junta that are actually carrying out these atrocities now, so knows this damage firsthand, and is now essentially turning a blind eye to it, if not through her inaction being seen as almost a participant in it. Also, a self-proclaimed Buddhist, and traditionally we think of Buddhists as non-violent, or at least being influenced by Gandhiism as well, and that sort of philosophy around nonviolent concepts. So, like, it's very difficult to comprehend how that, background can square up with what we're seeing today in terms of her inaction. I actually have a quote from her, however, that shows that there is a little bit of ambiguity in her sort of approach towards violent tactics. So this is something that she apparently said in 2007. She said, "I do not hold to nonviolence for moral reasons, but for political and practical reasons." So, why is it that she would, what is her political ambition here? Because obviously her inaction must have something to do with a sort of strategy or vision for Burma. And I know that that is partly connected to her father's vision for the country, and he was assassinated by the military junta. So maybe you could tease that out for us a bit.
Well, actually, I mean, these are all very good questions, and all those people who stood up and spoke out for her over the 2 decades that she was imprisoned and under house arrest, they are asking the same question, and so they cannot understand why a woman who committed herself to a nonviolent way of achieving democracy is now staying silent. She's been criticized and called out by various international statesmen, statespeople, and luminaries. The Dalai Lama has called on her to speak out on more than one occasion. In fact, he has condemned the actions of the Buddhists in Myanmar, saying that they do not represent the true face of Buddhism. And I think I just saw a quote recently which said, "If Buddha were alive today, he would be helping the Rohingya." She's also been called out by Bishop Desmond Tutu, another Nobel laureate.
Yeah, actually, you know what? I wanted to read a letter, an open letter that was written by Desmond Tutu to Aung San Suu Kyi, and perhaps we could use that letter to contextualize and understand some of the violence that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. So this is an open letter from Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu to Aung San Suu Kyi. "My dear Aung San Suu Kyi, I am now elderly, decrepit, and formally retired, but breaking my vow to remain silent on public affairs out of profound sadness about the plight of the Muslim minority in your country, the Rohingya. In my heart, you are a dearly beloved younger sister. For years, I had a photograph of you on my desk to remind me of the injustice and sacrifice you endured out of your love and commitment for Myanmar's people. You symbolized righteousness. In 2010, we rejoiced at your freedom from house arrest, and in 2012, we celebrated your election as leader of the opposition. Your emergence into public life allayed our concerns about violence being perpetrated against members of the Rohingya, but what some have called ethnic cleansing and others a slow genocide has persisted and recently accelerated. The images we are seeing of the suffering of the Rohingya fill us with pain and dread. We know that you know that human beings may look and worship differently, and some may have greater firepower than others, but none are superior and none inferior. That when you scratch the surface, we are all the same, members of one family, the human family. That there are no natural differences between Buddhists and Muslims, that whether we are Jews or Hindus, Christians or atheists, we are born to love without prejudice. Discrimination doesn't come naturally, it is taught. My dear sister, if the political price of your ascension to the highest office in Myanmar is your silence, the price is surely too steep. A country that is not at peace with itself, that fails to acknowledge and protect the dignity and worth of all its people, is not a free country. It is incongruous for a symbol of righteousness to lead such a country. It is adding to our pain. As we witness the unfolding horror, we pray for you to be courageous and resilient again. We pray for you to speak out for justice, human rights, and the unity of your people. We pray for you to intervene in the escalating crisis and guide your people back towards the path of righteousness." So again, these are examples of these high-profile state actors, really, who previously had feted her, who are now calling her out for these human rights violations.
Yeah, there's there's a lot of there's a lot of good comparisons actually to other leaders. So we mentioned Mandela. There's a lot of similarities with what happened in South Africa, right? Where Mandela came out of jail, he was elected president, and then people are happy. Okay, now we have liberal democracy, but we knew that behind the scenes, Mandela wasn't really the one calling the shots. He still had to deal with global imperialism. He still had to deal with the capitalist class. He still had to deal with the military. So just like in South Africa, my feel is that, and this is what I've heard from a lot of sources that I've been coming across, is I don't think she's not the one calling the shots in Myanmar. And it's not to defend her. I mean, if I was her, I would be speaking out too, just as I criticized Obama also for being silent with a lot of what the Pentagon was doing. But we do have to be compassionate to realize that it's really the military that's still calling the shots in Myanmar in many ways. And she might have a say in it, but there's also so much more that happens behind the scenes that's not covered in the media. So is she being blackmailed? Is her life being threatened? You know, there's so much other things to consider. You know what I mean? Just like Obama might have wanted to say a lot about what was going on, but we don't know behind the scenes. Perhaps he was being threatened. Perhaps, you know, there's so many ways that they control these liberal politicians, and it's not to defend them, it's just to understand what's really going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, I think you pick up on a good point, and it's always important to try and tease out, like, what are the political interests here, right? And I mean, as for myself, this is an issue that has, you know, recently entered my consciousness through being involved with this interview and really trying to acquire as much information as I could. Some of it through the mainstream media, which we obviously always know has a tendency to portray things in a particular way, as well as to serve particular interests, and don't always tell us the entire story. And that was like one of the big questions that I had is like, so like what is actually happening in this country in terms of like what are the political ambitions of the Burmese? Like, what is it? Is it that they just can't see a solution that involves the participation or the nationhood of the Rohingya people in that territory? Is it because they are, as has been described, fundamentalist Buddhists? Is it that...
Also, we shouldn't generalize. I mean, there's a lot of Burmese people. I mean, yeah, anyways.
Well, no, and I mean, so, like, I did come across some information that talks about some of the insurgent attacks that have taken place, and these are, like, counterattacks because, like, their villages are being burned, their people are being murdered, systematically targeted, women are being raped, and there have been several higher-profile insurgent attacks really against high-profile political officials, and some of them have died, and that has actually led to increased violence on the part of Myanmar against the Rohingya people. So maybe we can try and connect to that and get a better understanding of like what's actually happening within this territory politically, culturally.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me reference there are a number of points that both of you made. So let me start with the earlier points. Yeah, is she being controlled by the military? Well, the military, yes, does. And when they rewrote the Constitution, they gave themselves 25% of the seats in the new legislature. However, the fact that the military still has such a strong role, I think, should not preclude someone who is the leader of the nation from speaking out.
I agree.
She has a platform, and she, I think, personally, I mean, obviously, I don't know what is happening on the ground there in those, back rooms, but as a leader, she has a platform, and plus, she has a stature now that if the military didn't like what they were saying, they would be challenged by the world community who was standing up for her for decades. So if she did speak out, and if she criticized what was going on, I mean, that would be great. But the thing is, she hasn't even acknowledged the fact that there is ethnic cleansing. In her speech last week, she commented, that was the first reference that she made to what's been going on, and she didn't even really say anything about the Rohingya other than to say, well, we have to get to the bottom of the reasons about why all these people are leaving. Well, and the thing is that is just such a ludicrous statement to make. And when she made that speech, leaders the world over were basically, to use an expression, WTF, what's going on? Like, does she not realize, or is she so now connected to the military that she refuses to even acknowledge the fact that these atrocities are being committed? And that's not the first time that this issue has been brought to the attention of not just the world, but also to the government of Myanmar. There was actually a task force, I don't remember the exact name of it, that was headed by the former Secretary General, Kofi Annan, that went in to research what was going on, and they submitted a report, and they basically acknowledged the fact that there are crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing going on, and that the government needs to acknowledge that. But those recommendations weren't even accepted. So, I mean, everybody would love to know what's going on inside her head and why she is behaving the way she is, because she stood up for democracy. In fact, when Canada gave her the honorary citizenship, in a speech in the House of Commons, and I believe it was the Prime Minister at the time, Stephen Harper, said that she embodied the principles of freedom, democracy, respect for human rights, and rule of law. That is enhanced in the House of Commons.
And also recorded. It's extremely hypocritical coming from Stephen Harper.
Oh yeah, well, that's a totally other. You could do a whole program on that. But the thing is that was one of the basis on which she received that honor, because she was said to embody these principles, and now she's finally reached the stage of being a leader of the nation, and she seems to have totally thrown out the philosophies which got her there, and she has bought into this. Basically, I mean, it's a hate philosophy against the Rohingya. And just to put the population in context, there's a Buddhist nationalist leader. He's a Buddhist monk. His name is Ashin Viratu, and in 2013, Time did a cover with a photograph of him, and the title underneath the photograph was "The Face of Buddhist Terrorism." Okay, and he is the leader of this very fanatical, I would call it a cult. I don't know what else to call it, of Myanmar nationalists who are all Buddhists, and he has fomented violence and hatred against the Rohingya.
But keeping it real, there's probably a lot of Burmese that are also against the violence that's going on. I mean,
well, we have yet to hear from them, though. That's the thing. I don't know if that's because the media hasn't been able to get there, or they're afraid to speak out. But when you see the powers in your state, like the military, and a nationalist group that has support from the military and the government, going out there and vilifying a people, even if you believe this is totally wrong, would you put yourself and the lives of your family at risk by speaking out publicly? I mean, we've seen it historically. If you go back to World War II and Nazi Germany, and people who spoke out against what the Nazis were doing to the Jews were targeted, and some of them were sent to concentration camps. So it's a risk literally to life and limb.
Now,
sorry, I just wanted to make one. With respect to the place of the Rohingya in Myanmar, they represent. It's roughly about 1 million before this latest wave of refugees started, and that represents just under 1.9% of Myanmar's total population of 52.9 million. Less than 1.9%. And they are a marginalized community. They've been marginalized for decades. The legislation which I referred to in 1982, which stripped them of their rights and didn't allow them to regain any rights, it also prevented them from seeking a livelihood in any publicly funded capacity. So they can't be doctors, they can't work in hospitals, they can't work as teachers, they can't work in government, they can't be in the military.
Was there not also a cap on how many children they were allowed to have?
I don't recall seeing that. If that's the case, I would love you to show me that source. But also, in some instances, they had to get approval on who they could marry. So this is a minority group in this nation that has had basically a wall built around them, in a metaphorical wall, well, in some cases a physical wall itself, because they were displaced within Myanmar. They were put in detention camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. So to know that history and to see the situation that they're in, how is it that they are seen as any sort of threat? And with respect to the recent attacks that you referenced, Jared, those attacks did not come. It has not been something that's been going on for decades. It is a more recent phenomena, and it's in reaction to the persecution and the death and destruction that is being inflicted upon the Rohingya.
So my question for you is, because I want an end to the crisis too, for sure, and I'm most definitely for nonviolence, especially when it comes to Muslims. Too many Muslims are being attacked globally. So I want an end to this crisis for sure, and I want an end to the violence. But I want to understand what's really going on, you know what I mean? Because what you hear from CBC or the corporate media, as we both know, is not necessarily a complete picture. So, for example, what do you feel is the interest of the United States in all of this? We know that the U.S. Was supporting Aung San Suu Kyi for a long time. They invested a lot in her campaigns through the National Endowment for Democracy. And we know that now, more recently, her government has been strengthening ties with China, has cut deals with China. There's a pipeline in particular, the Shui pipeline, that they're wanting to build through that area. And that would obviously make it easier for China to get their oil. It'd be cheaper for them. So there's a lot of geopolitics going on in this, and that's why it's complicated. Like I definitely agree the violence needs to stop, but also we do need to consider how perhaps the U.S. is taking advantage of the situation in order to perhaps use the crisis as leverage against China, in order to perhaps keep Myanmar in the U.S. empire, basically.
So the thing about that is,
them,
and I definitely think that's an
AMI
piece.
podcast.
However, I think it's important to recognize the opportunism that we've historically seen from the United States to capitalize on political crises in other countries for their own political gain detracts almost nothing from the actual crises itself, right? So, like, independent of American interests in Myanmar, or whether or not Myanmar is strengthening relationships with China and how that may challenge the United States' position as a superpower as they battle it out with China, that also doesn't change the fact that, like, if we can accept what we're seeing happening in Myanmar as a genocide, it doesn't detract from what is actually taking place within that geographic territory. Although it's important to see this, like, actual moral position of the United States when they're actually drawing attention to this issue, and whether they're trying to discredit or undermine what's happening in Myanmar.
That's what they've been doing in Syria, right? Like, there's a lot of similarities here. So, for example, in Syria, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and other countries, Canada as well, was supporting terrorists in Syria in order to destabilize the country because they wanted regime change, because Assad was more independent from the U.S. And that's what they do. So they'll also they'll create attacks. So they were doing the chemical attacks. We know that the CIA was involved in this, that some of the terrorist groups were involved in killing the civilians in Syria. And then blaming it on the government, right? So in Myanmar, for example, I mean, clearly the military there is definitely killing the Rohingya Muslims. But what else is going on, right? That's why I feel we need to investigate, like, is the CIA involved in this? We know that Saudi Arabia is funding these insurgents that we're talking about, which I agree with you is probably just a small minority. And probably, yes, they feel they're doing it in self-defense. And everyone has the right to self-defense. But keeping it real, Saudi Arabia doesn't really care about human rights. They support terrorism in order to use that as leverage against countries for their own interests, right? So there's so much more to this that's going on. For Fareed, your thoughts?
Well, you referenced a number of things which I have not come across, so I'm not going to comment on those. The only thing that I've heard coming out of the U.S. recently was the Vice President Mike Pence actually condemning what's going on in Myanmar. That is the highest person in the U.S. administration who has currently responded to this issue, and there are grassroots organizations in the U.S. who are, also calling same as here in Canada, who are calling on the U.S. government to take action on this. And yes, geopolitics does have a role to play, but the thing is that irrespective of that, we in the West, whether it's the U.S. or Canada or other nations, we talk about our respect for democracy, our respect for human rights, and in this we have been totally silent. And it's one of the reasons I actually started my petition, which now has over 40,000 signatures. I've been following the Rohingya issue for years, and every time that it came up in the news, I thought, okay, someone's going to do something. It would fade away, and some other crisis would happen. But then in August, when I started seeing the reports again, I was waiting for governments to, and civil society organizations to act, and I didn't see anything happening. So I started my petition. I went on to change.org and I created the petition, and it started gathering signatures right away. And as of yesterday, it's over 41,000 signatures. And the comments that I'm receiving from people, and I've been asked now, to speak at various events, and people are coming up to me and saying, thank you, we need to do this. And I realized that the petition itself, it asks for a symbolic act. But in that symbolic act, if Canada were to do that, if Prime Minister Justin Trudeau were to accept these 40,000 plus voices who have said, take action, revoke her honorary citizenship because she no longer stands for the ideals for which she received that honor, it would send such a huge signal to the world that Canada is willing to act. In addition, last week, the Prime Minister was at the United Nations to speak at the General Assembly. And while I understand that he has an agenda with respect to resolving the issue of the atrocities that the Indigenous Canadians have suffered over the last 100 years and the discrimination that they continue to suffer, I respect that, and I think that's a great thing.
We got a lot of human rights violations going on here. We have Muslims being killed here, and our own government, keeping it real, is also killing Muslims. The war in Afghanistan, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, right? So for me, Justin Trudeau criticizing other people for attacking Muslims, it's good that he's doing that, but you have to practice what you preach.
Well, yes, and to your point, the fact is that regardless of where we may be deficient here, I think it's still incumbent on us as a democratic nation to speak out when we see atrocities being committed anywhere against any people, regardless of whether or not we have any sort of pecuniary, political, or economic interest in that region. And so he spoke at the United Nations, and I was supremely disappointed that he did not devote a few paragraphs to the situation of the Rohingya, even though other leaders who had gotten up to speak at the podium had. And I want to clarify one thing. There is constantly a reference to Rohingya Muslims. The thing is, all Rohingya are not Muslims.
Some of them are
the majority are, but there is a minority that are Hindu, and they are being persecuted by the Myanmar military and the Myanmar government as well.
Thank you for mentioning that. No,
so it's not just Muslims. Yes, they are the majority, but I think we have to remember that this is not an issue about Muslims. It's a issue about an ethnic minority who have suffered for decades under the oppression of the military. And with respect to China, when this was raised at the United Nations by some of the leaders, the ambassador from China basically said, people should butt out. This is an internal matter, so you should not be getting involved in this.
So let's pick up there, because I think historically, when we've seen examples of genocides taking place, Cambodia, the Kurdish during the Iran-Iraq War, Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis, Bosnia. Like, there was a failure to act on the internet on the part of the international community in many cases for too long, right? And I'm wondering in this case if it is an example of a failure to act.
I totally agree.
It's extremely problematic. Like, I'm not even going to get into those other issues because we don't have enough time. I'm actually Burundian, so I know that situation very well. And that's the double standard of the international community. And I don't want to come across as uncompassionate about the plight of the Rohingyas. I want the crisis to end. And my hope is actually that we can have a process of national reconciliation in Myanmar that's led by Myanmar and perhaps the surrounding communities there, so that those communities can resolve this on their own. Perhaps Bangladesh can be a part of that. It's just the West has extreme double standard when it comes to these kind of issues. You know what I mean? For example, the corporate media right now is big on this crisis, and it's important. It should get some media attention. But what about Yemen? What about Palestine? What about so many other... You know what I mean? So I just feel the West... we could work through the UN and we can raise awareness about the issue and perhaps focus on conflict resolution. But for the West, for Canada, the idea of intervening and protecting human rights usually means regime change. It usually means going in, killing the leader, and in all cases making the situation worse. So in Libya, for example,
I would disagree with you there because the similar thing happened in Kosovo in the late 90s, and you had the Serb leader Slobodan Milosevic and his cronies who were ethnically cleansing the Kosovars, and that was the first time that the doctrine of responsibility to protect was used, where actually NATO went in. And created a safe haven for the Kosovars so that they could live in peace. And I think that that doctrine was actually adopted as a policy at the UN, and Canada is a signatory to that, and that happened in 2005. And this is a prime example of where R2P, responsibility to protect, should be used. Unfortunately, I mean, I have a healthy degree of cynicism about the way these things work internationally, because in order for that to happen, it requires a resolution at the UN to take place. It requires the Security Council to chime in on that. And you can be certain that if this issue was brought to the Security Council for international forces to go in, create a safe haven for Rohingya, to allow them to become part of society again and live in a land that they've been in for centuries, that if that was brought to the or to the Security Council as a resolution, you can be sure that China is going to step up and veto it, or even Russia is going to step up and veto it.
And there's a healthy reason why. Like Libya, please, listeners, everybody, follow what's going on in Libya. Libya is a destroyed country. Many people have been killed.
2011.
I'm talking. Many people have been killed in Libya because of this responsibility to protect. The West, Canada included, went to the UN and said, "Oh, we just want to protect the civilians there. Gaddafi's killing his people," and Russia and China went along with it because they were promised that it was just going to be limited and it was just going to be about removing Gaddafi, and that was a lie. Hillary Clinton lied to them, lied to Russia and China, went in, killed Gaddafi, but also destroyed the country. They had promised they weren't going to remove Gaddafi, and so. The West uses this whole responsibility to protect in order to do regime change, in order to remove leaders that go against imperialism. Keeping it real. So what's
your solution then? We have a people who have been persecuted for decades, who have been murdered, butchered, slaughtered. They are now being killed in massive numbers by the government forces and by nationalists in Myanmar, creating the fastest growing humanitarian crisis that we've seen since what happened in Syria. What do you do? Because the thing is that I agree with you with respect to Libya, that it was the way it was handled has basically destroyed that country and now created a haven where we have terrorists who are training.
There's Syria, there's Iraq, there's Afghanistan.
Okay, so in this situation, what do you do when you have a people? let me put it in another context. You have a neighbor who who abuses his family, he abuses his spouse and his children. You're aware of it. You can't stand it, abide by it. Though, that you have to do something. But if you do something, those children will be taken away from their family, right? And they'll be placed in foster care. And you're not comfortable with that. So what do you do in that situation? Do you report it to the police or whoever the authorities are? Or do you sit back and let just things take their course? I, for one, and the hundreds of thousands of other people across the country and Canada, as well as in the U.S. and around the world, who are speaking out and getting active on this, are saying we can't let this happen because if we allow it to happen, then it basically puts to shame our claims of wanting freedom and democracy and protection of human rights for people everywhere. It basically says, yeah, you know what, we're happy to espouse those values as long as we don't have to get our hands dirty, as long as we don't have to work within certain lines.
There's a quote from a Julian Assange article that I really like, and it essentially says that when one is witness to an injustice but fails to act, one then becomes a party to that injustice, right? And so just hear me out. So here's where I'm going with this. The reality on the ground is, with the information that we currently do have, is what's happening in Myanmar is consistent with genocide, right? And so I know in some of the presentations that you've given a presentation recently in Montreal, you talk about how they're at a particular stage in genocide. I know there are different models that sort of outline what a genocide looks like in terms of stages. I see some consistency with this model that I was able to kind of uncover that has 8 stages: classification, symbolization, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, extermination, and then denial. And I've seen this sort of dehumanization even in the part of the language of the state
Agreed.
where they're refusing to actually acknowledge the Rohingya people as Rohingya people. They won't even use that word, right? And actually, the Aung San Suu Kyi herself has refused to even
exactly.
acknowledge,
I agree. It's
right?
just,
so you see the systematic dehumanization, almost denial of these people as a nation.
I agree with that. And something needs to be done. It's just, unfortunately, for a lot of people, that something is always war, more violence.
Yeah.
Go in there with the military. I'm sorry, a military isn't. There's no military solution in this.
So let's get to what Fareed's asking for, though.
Let me finish, because he asked me, what can we do? You're already doing that. You're raising awareness. That's what we're doing right now, educating ourselves about what's going on there. We can work through the UN. We can work through nonviolent means, raising awareness. There is power in meditation. There's power in prayer. I trust that the Burmese people themselves, many Burmese people, want to resolve this crisis as well, because it's not good for them either. Asia is a sovereign continent. They can handle this themselves as well. In Afghanistan, that's what a lot of people are calling for now, is an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned national reconciliation process. That's what's going on in Libya right now. That's what's going on in Syria, because we need a political solution. The different countries that are intervening right now, supporting different sides, like Saudi Arabia, supporting different groups there with arms, that's not helpful, right? So for me,
I'm sorry,
you can't get a positive out of a negative. We need to focus on violence. We need to focus on finding a political, diplomatic solution to this.
I'm sorry, I have to disagree with you that there are times, as much as we don't want it to happen, there are times where we need to take forceful action, because
and
right
it's illegal.
now, as we wait,
I'm sorry, that's not legal.
As we like, we're discussing this. I've been now discussing this for almost a month, and in that time, we've had 500,000 people displaced. We've had over 200 villages burnt to the ground,
and there will be more if you go in there and
thousands, and we've had thousands and thousands of people who have been, butchered by the military. And the thing is, when you're dealing with a military only understand military solutions. They don't respect diplomacy. They don't respect, civil society solutions. They only understand military solutions. And as distasteful as that might be in this situation, in order to create a barrier between those who are doing the persecuting and those who are being persecuted, you need to actually put a force in between those two people.
And there's a thing called international law where Canada cannot just go and send troops wherever it likes. That's illegal.
No, not by itself it can't, but there are mechanisms
that's
available.
unlawful. You can't intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. That's why I do agree with China that we do need to respect the sovereignty of Myanmar. Yes, we can use soft power. Yes, we can use diplomacy. Talking to Myanmar, they have an embassy here. Let's talk to them. Let's continue to raise
They're
awareness.
unwilling to talk. That's the thing. They're even unwilling to acknowledge the people, let alone the fact that this is taking place. How do you talk to anyone who refuses to acknowledge that something is happening when all the facts?
So you're just
going
to go in and kill them?
No, you're going to go in and you're going to go in and you're going to put yourself a force between the people who are the victims and the people who are the persecutors.
I'm sorry, man. That's not how NATO works. That's not how NATO works, man.
Like the tactic that can be used to address this situation, right? So, like we've taken to the extreme that the West is going to go in there on a responsibility to protect and set up like a military outpost and essentially, shut things down.
Which would be illegal and would make the
in other
situation
states,
worse.
Libya being a good example of that.
And that's why I actually feel Canada should get out of NATO.
So here's where I'm going with this, right?
It doesn't make the situation better.
So there are other, so we're talking about solutions, right? There are other diplomatic solutions that are available, right? And there are other pressures that can be put on a country. You're starting out with a very simple request, I think, which is to seek out the revocation of Aung San Suu Kyi's honorary citizenship as a symbolic step on the part of the Canadian state to acknowledge what is happening in Myanmar. Mm-hmm. Flowing from that, what other options are there then? Besides, you're talking about respecting the sovereignty of this state and allowing other people in Southeast Asia to perhaps go in there and address things. What other non-violent options are available?
Yeah, because I'm sorry, man.
This is the question.
And I feel you. I admire. We're not enemies here, right?
No.
I know we're passionate, but I respect your. It's very noble to want to put an end to the crisis. I'm from Burundi. I'm African, man. We know about war. I lost family to war. I just know that war is not the solution, and it's not up to the white man to police the world. Because there's imperialist interests. And it's clear. Do you feel Donald Trump cares about Muslims when he's killing?
No, and I,
Yemenis,
like that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a totally different, subject which I could go off on for hours.
These are white supremacists, man. They don't care about human rights. I'm sorry.
You know what? I disagree because you know what? In the case of the Canadians who I've spoken with, the non-Muslim Canadians who have approached me to talk about this, who have signed on to the petition, to my petition, these are people who look at the world as they would like to see it. They would like to see a world where the people have the same sort of rights that we have in Canada. The freedom to freedom of speech, freedom to practice your faith freely. And you know what? The world isn't perfect, and Canada is not perfect. And I'll be the first to admit that. There is no such thing as perfection. We will never achieve perfection. There will always be things that we are not happy about. But in this case, we have a direct connection to Myanmar through the award the honor that we gave her, and to have her sit in the company of people like Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, Malala Yousafzai, the Aga Khan, who also received a honorary citizenship. I think that Canadians should be outraged by that, but we should even be more outraged by the fact that here is someone who was supposed to stand for democracy and freedom and protection of human rights, and yet she has totally turned everything on its head, and she is now refusing to acknowledge what's going on. She's even praised the military in some of her remarks. So what are we to do? Like, if this was your family, you're here, you have family over there, they're being killed, their neighbors are being killed, their friends are being killed, and you can't do anything from this distance. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do in that situation?
Well, I strongly believe in the power of raising awareness, the power of that's what Gandhi.
That's what we're doing.
And that's what Gandhi would say too, right? Is being the change you want to see in the world. That's why healing ourselves, renouncing violence ourselves, being the change. Stop the violence yourself. Why is Canada selling arms to Saudi Arabia, right?
Oh, that's a different subject. I understand. I
know what I mean?
You've touched on a whole lot of different topics.
And also, I don't believe in revoking citizenship. There's a right to citizenship, and I don't feel the state has a right to revoke citizenship. That's what the Tories were trying to do revoke the citizenship
what the
of
Tories
people?
were doing was a totally different fact. And in fact, we have actually a legal precedent in Canada to revoke citizenship, because back in the 80s, there was a former concentration camp guard who was found out to have been a Nazi working in a concentration camp, who was involved in the killing of Jews in concentration camps. He was taken to trial in the 80s. His citizenship was stripped long before Stephen Harper and what we have today, and he was deported. Okay, and in the case of Aung San Suu Kyi, this is an honor. She does not have the same rights and privileges as other Canadians. This was an honor we bestowed on her, the same way that the Nobel Peace Prize was an honor that was bestowed on her.
Interestingly enough, the Nobel Committee said that there is no mechanism in place to revoke her Nobel Peace Prize.
Well,
Also, once keeping it real, being the change, right? You mentioned the Rohingyas had their citizenship removed, right? I'm just saying, this whole thing about I and I. Okay, they took away our citizenship. We have to take away theirs. I mean, for one, I actually believe in a more global form of citizenship. I feel we're all citizens of the world, and if Aung San Suu Kyi came here, that would be a good opportunity to talk to her. Hey, what's going on? Because you brought up family and neighbors a lot, and I feel we should look at the world that way, that we are a community and we do have to live in peace. I just feel there are more constructive ways to resolve the crisis than starting to talk about revoking citizenships. And I'm sorry, man, it's a terrible precedent when the state has a right to. The state does not have a right to revoke citizenship, man.
This is an honorary citizenship.
This is not.
That
Yeah,
was
this is
bestowed
not
upon
the-
her for
it's
her
not- it's not-
record.
It's a slippery slope. I'm sorry.
I would completely disagree with you, because it is not the same as the citizenship that the three of us have as Canadians. We have certain rights and responsibilities as Canadians as under that citizenship.
And when we
gave
talk
her-
about revoking citizenship, it's usually non-whites. There's one guy, Deepon, here in Ottawa, who the Canadian government, as we speak, is trying to take away his citizenship. You know what I mean? That the government has been trying to take away the citizenship of non-whites.
Yes,
I feel that is a difficult matter to fit within the context of the conversation we're having today.
Yeah.
Personally. But we are getting towards the end of the show, and we've had, I think, quite a lively discussion. We've got to sort of see this issue from many different sides, which is really what it's about. You got to be able to look at issues from all angles. So as we get ready to close out, I just want to extend a thank you to Farid Khan for coming on the show today. And I did just want to also make mention of a vigil that is going to be held this Thursday from 7 to 9 p.m. at 111 Wellington Street.
That's actually Parliament Hill.
Right on Parliament Hill.
Yeah, right on Parliament
Yeah.
Hill, in front of the Parliament building.
So it's going to be a vigil for the Rohingyas. Everybody is invited to come out if they're interested in showing their support. And before you close, I would just like to make one other comment to all your listeners. I would greatly appreciate it if you could go onto the platform change.org to find my petition. It's under my name, Farid Khan, and it's asking to revoke the honorary citizenship of Aung San Suu Kyi. But that's just one aspect of it. There are a number of other points which I didn't get to in our discussion that are more concrete in terms of working with the international communities, working with human rights organizations, the UN Commission for Human Rights.
That I support.
To deal with the humanitarian
Amnesty
crisis,
International.
and for Canada to take a very vocal and constructive stand on this, because up until now we've had some comments by the Canadian government, but we have not seen Canada step up the way it should be stepping up on this very, very sad issue. So I urge your listeners to please go to the petition, sign it, share it in your social media circles, so that we can get moving on this crisis and save lives on the ground.
Thank you very much, Farid.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Okay.
Sorry, I know I was very passionate about this,
I know,
but I do respect your admiration for protecting human rights, and I definitely support you on that one. Let's work together on that.
Oh yeah,
for sure.
definitely. And there was an English statesman who said that if good men and women stay silent when they see injustice, then it basically helps those who are committing the injustices. And I and many people refuse to stay silent.
All right. Well, we'll be back next week.
Another great show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're tuned to CKCU 93.1 FM in Ottawa.